Now I have neither happiness nor unhappiness. Everything passes. That is the one and only thing that I have learned resembling a truth in the society of human beings where I have dwelled up until now as in a burning hell. Everything passes. No Longer Human is a semi-autobiographical novel by Osamu Dazai, following a man wallowing in depression and despair while leading a life of deception and addiction. We follow him through his downward spiral in an unflinching look at what it would feel like to be in this man's skin. In this video, I'm going to be reviewing the story of No Longer Human. I will be reviewing the book and both of the adaptations that came after it. Although, considering that both of the manga are essentially the exact same story with some minor variations in there, I will just basically spend most of my time discussing the book and reviewing the story itself. And then after that, I'll go through and I'll discuss the adaptations individually and kind of how they compare to the actual primary story, which is the book. Now, like I said, they say that this story is semi-autobiographical. That is due to the fact that all of the characters are fictional. The main character himself is fictional, but the main character has a lot of the characteristics that Dazai himself had. He then also suffers from a lot of the same problems and anxieties and depression and social anxieties that Dazai suffered from in his life. Dazai suffered greatly from social alienation, depression, and suicide. As a matter of fact, Dazai himself attempted suicide 5 different times in his life, actually finally succeeding shortly after writing this book. As a matter of fact, the book was released about a month after his death. No Longer Human is considered to be Osamu Dazai's masterpiece, and I absolutely agree with that assessment. I think that it should be considered a masterpiece by pretty much any standard. It is the most intensely real and realistic look at this particular subject matter that I have ever personally read under any medium. And I say that even considering that some of the events in the story can seem maybe a little bit unrealistic or at the very least exaggerated as you go through. But that's not the point. The point is, what does it feel like to exist inside of this man's mind as he goes throughout his life? And in that regards, I would have to say that this is probably the most hauntingly accurate representation of what exactly that would feel like. The book is framed by a prologue and an epilogue. Those both are written from the perspective of a man who has happened upon these notebooks, and the notebooks contain like a journal of a man's life. What then comes in between the prologue and the epilogue are the journals. Now, what's inside those journals is Oba's story, starting as a child. And in his childhood, he had a very troubled relationship with both his father and his older brother. Also, as a child, he was sexually abused by both an older man and an older woman. Then when Oba grows up, he feels different from other people. Like he's just unable to connect with other people. Like he's somehow different from other human beings. He literally feels like he has to pretend to be human because he feels like he's something else entirely. Something darker, something broken, something literally not even worthy of being called human. This feeling inside of him then leads him to abuse alcohol and eventually drugs. Although he does seem to attract women throughout his life, or at the very least, he has a way with women, which then leads him to kind of be taken care of by women or be taken in by women, which then leads him to take advantage of those women. Maybe. Because in his own mind, he very much so sees himself as taking advantage of these women throughout his entire life. But as we see in the epilogue, one of those women actually remembers him extremely fondly and remembers him as if he were an extremely good person. which is extremely different from the way that he presents himself in the book. He presents himself as a pretty awful person and pretty awful to these other people in his life. But then again, he's always trying to play a character and pretend to be somebody that he's not. So we're left wondering at the end of the book, do these people see him as a good person because he successfully put on that front and he successfully tricked them into thinking that he was a good person, all the while he was actually a terrible person? Or was he actually just a much better person in his life than he thought he was, and he just had this mental image of him being such a terrible person, and we're just so stuck inside of his head that that's all we get to see inside of these journals is just how awful he thinks he is. Essentially making him kind of like an unreliable narrator, because all we get to see is him as a bad person because he sees himself as a bad person. And doesn't even matter. Like, for example, what's more real? The actual objective reality of a situation, or the perceived reality inside of somebody's mind of a situation? Of course, the answer to that is the actual objective reality of the situation. But I would argue that the perceived reality inside of this kind of a depressed and arguably diseased mind that would be so much more powerful and impactful than any objective reality that he might be experiencing at that moment in time. And I don't care how good of a person you are, if you actually did and or said some of the things that he does in this book, you would start to obsess, you would start to dwell, and you would start to hate yourself. And the downward spiral that followed would be very real. Now, me personally, I am reading this from the perspective of somebody who in my life has at times struggled with substance abuse. I also have a dual diagnosis of major depression and bipolar disorder. So I can tell you from my experience, once you allow yourself to go down that dark road, it is extremely easy to wind up in a position where you just hate yourself, and then it is extremely difficult to come back from that. Although when I say that, that is just the lens that I personally view the story through, because that is my personal reality that I have existed in my life. Although I can see why many people from many different situations would come at this or view this from a different perspective than maybe I do. So also on that note, when I say that this is an extremely accurate representation of what it feels like to be in that situation, I absolutely mean it. But that then also makes this an extremely hard read. There is not a morsel of hope at the center of this story. There is not a light at the end of the tunnel. It is raw, it is ugly, and it is real. And even if the events in the story aren't real, the representation of depression and despair is very real. And I cannot give this book anything other than an absolute 10 out of 10. It really, truly, genuinely is a masterpiece. Now, with that out of the way, we're going to move on to the adaptations. Now, I will say that I think Junji Ito's version follows the actual book and the events of the book a little bit more closely and a little bit more accurately than Usamaru's does, but they both take liberties with the story at certain points. Then, as you might expect in the story, Junji Ito takes the liberty of leaning into the horror of the situation a little bit more than, say, the hopelessness and the despair of it, which then, in my opinion, leaves the manga feeling a little bit at odds with the actual book, at least in terms of tone. At the very least, I would say that the tone of Junji Ito's manga missed the mark a little bit, at least when compared to the tone of the book. Although, that being said, maybe he didn't miss the mark. Maybe he did exactly what he intended to do and did what I said a second ago, which is lean into the horror of the situation and really try and emphasize that to show a different perspective. Or maybe that's his perspective on the story. I don't know. He also literally inserts himself into the story as a character at one point towards the end, kind of as a replacement for that opening prologue and epilogue that you got in the original one to set it up as a man finding a set of journals. He then puts himself in as a man discovering this story so that he can then put it into the book. essentially just a different way of getting around that problem of how does the author discover this story. Then after that, we have the one by Osamu, which I'm for some reason having a really hard time saying that name. This adaptation leans way more into the depression and the isolation of the main character, at least in the sense of how the art is portrayed and presented, which then makes it feel, in my opinion, like the tone of this manga is closer to the tone of the book. But then this one takes a little bit more liberties with the story. It is not quite as accurate. It also transposes it and moves it forward in time. So instead of being represented as a period piece, kind of the period that the book was written in, it moves it into the modern day with computers and technology. And now, instead of journals being found by an author, it's this guy who comes across a website where this has been detailed online. But then the story had this tendency to like explain the important things or how he was feeling or what just happened in these dialogue boxes, kind of giving you the feeling that it was explaining the story to you rather than showing and telling through the events. It just felt like the story was being explained to you rather than just letting you experience the story. Now, also, this is entirely my personal preference. I think the story just works better as a period piece in the time that the original story was written. Something about it doesn't translate well to the modern age, especially the counterculture group that he gets mixed in with in the early parts of the book, and the transition from alcohol abuse to drug abuse. Neither of those two beats translated very well at all when the author tried to modernize them. Anyway, so at the end of the day, I'm gonna have to be that guy. And I'm going to say, if you're going to experience this story, I recommend the book. Start there. It is by far the best version of the story, which is kind of to be expected considering that it is the original version of the story. And it's not long. It's like 175 pages. This is an itty bitty little book. You could knock that out in an afternoon, even if you're not a reader. Now, that being said, if you absolutely don't like reading and you just prefer the medium of manga, you're just a manga reader, then that's fine too. These stories, both of them, would do perfectly well. Pick up either one of them and you will be fine because they both essentially tell the same story, like I said, with a little tweak here and there on both of their parts. But I would say that both adaptations are actually extremely well done, and it feels like they both approached the material with a massive amount of respect for the source material, which, when you're attempting to adapt something like this, is absolutely paramount. Now, back me into a corner, twist my arm, I have no choice but to pick an adaptation. I would say I personally enjoyed Junji Ito's a little bit more, but that is 100% my preference and my taste, and I have actually heard online people say the exact opposite of that. They much prefer Osamu's over Ito's. And at that point, I would have to say it's probably just going to come down to your taste and your style and what you prefer. Even though, like I said, Junji Ito's was a little bit off the mark as in terms of tone, whereas Osamu's was probably closer. I don't know. Anyway, that's just my taste, I guess. Anyway, everybody, as always, the link for my Patreon's in the description below. The link for my Discord's in the description below. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.